Thank you, Representative Brevard, and thank you, Representative Merceau, for your testimony. It kind of reminds me when I was first campaigning, and one of the people I was talking to said we need to do something about Wisconsin wetlands laws because wetlands are only good for breeding mosquitoes and frogs. So I wonder if that's kind of the intent of going after this bill, and I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment, but I do want to kind of look at things from a broad perspective, because I think a lot of times people don't understand a lot of concepts in Wisconsin law or in nature's law. Could the DNR please elaborate on why Wisconsin protects its wetlands? I mean, are they more than just a breeding ground for mosquitoes and frogs, or is there a purpose for protecting Wisconsin's wetlands?
Well, I think it's, the legislature has said there's a purpose for it with previous law that it's appropriate for the department to have a wetland protection program, and we have done that because of all the functional values that wetlands provide, including flood protection and habitat and just a myriad, recharge. There's all kinds of functional issues that say wetlands are a good thing. I guess my own opinion is that we're not, this bill does not change the standards for wetland fills. So if you're concerned that that this bill is going to increase the amount of fill that we've got in wetlands, I don't think that's the case. My opinion.
My concern is that this is going to increase the amount of fill in exceptional wetlands in Wisconsin.
And I think if you look at the bill and study it, what we have not changed is the standards for individual permits. Individual permits are still the same. We still have avoidance, we still have minimization, and there still cannot be any significant impact. That has not changed. What we have done is we've synced this process up with the existing Chapter 30 process to avoid some of the confusion. And we've also required mitigation for all individual permits, and I think that's a benefit. So if you look at the mitigation funds that were in place before, we didn't do a lot of mitigation because it wasn't required. It's required for everything.
I'm going to get to mitigation with some of my questions, but I'd like to further expand upon some of these concepts. So you're saying that Wisconsin protects its wetlands because they serve a definite purpose, the purpose being the biodiversity of our state, the flood control measures, the water purification functions, which I'll get to this later, but it's very difficult to try to replicate those in an artificial wetland. But another real important concept that a lot of times people look past and don't have a real good understanding is dealing with private property rights. So the filling in of wetlands, is that a right that private property owners have on their property? Could you explain how that kind of works in Wisconsin law?
Well, it's not a right. There's no right to fill in wetland properties in the state of Wisconsin. In fact, long-standing case law would suggest there's a public interest in it, and that's why the legislature has enacted the provisions of Chapter 280.
So are wetlands within the boundaries of somebody's private property? Are they owned by the property owner?
Well, it depends. It could be owned by the property owner, or it could be owned by the state, depending upon if it's continued to it with a navigable body of water, by a lake or stream, or primarily a lake rather. But wetland ownership, the property title itself is owned by individuals generally. Even along streams, the property owner is the general owner. If it's a wetland adjacent to a lake, it may be held in trust by the state.
Okay, but they don't have a right to necessarily do what they want with a wetland. Whereas in general, private property owners have a lot of rights to do what they want with their land.
Yeah, that's what the permit program is about.
So we have a permit program that limits private property owners' rights on wetlands because of their tremendous importance to Wisconsin's cultural and economic and environmental heritage, correct?
I think that's right.
Okay. And Wisconsin wetlands have evolved over 10,000 years, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, Wisconsin, since the last glacial period is when the wetlands of Wisconsin have essentially been formed.
Yeah.
And over the course of the last 150 years, could you explain what percentage of wetlands in Wisconsin have been lost to development?
Well, we've lost, our best estimates are we've lost about half the wetlands in the state from, probably most of it's probably drainage, from agricultural purposes, but, our best estimates, about 5 million acres were lost to primarily drainage, I believe, but, some development as well too.
Is drainage not development? If you're draining something to develop fields for agriculture, is that?
If you call it development, that's what it is.
Okay, so it took 10,000 years for us to get the wetlands that we had in Wisconsin. In just the last 200 years, we've wiped out half of the wetlands in Wisconsin.
Well, we did, and we've lost a lot of wetlands from either fill or drainage, and I think that was in part the purpose for the legislature and the Department of Natural Resources to adopt DNR 103 to have more proactive standards for wetlands.
Okay, and would you say, could you give me an estimate or a percentage of what percentage of the Wisconsin's topography is wetland and what percentage of that is exceptional wetlands?
I'm going to refer to Lisa, that she might have that answer.
Well, I don't know what you mean by exceptional wetlands, so I guess.
Well,
I can't really
ASNREs
answer.
or exceptional wetland resources, state natural area type.
Yeah, many of those, they're not cataloged by acreage, so that's difficult to answer. Estimates are pre-settlement that there were 4 million acres, give or take, of wetlands in Wisconsin, and that we've lost approximately half of that, so it would be, give or take about 2 million acres of wetlands in the state right now. Contrast that with our regulatory program, we issue permits for probably under 100 acres of fill a year.
So we're talking a pretty small percentage of Wisconsin's topography is actually wetlands.
I think that's fair to say.
And some of these extremely rare wetlands, would it be safe to say that less than 1% of the topography is made up of, say, these 7 type of wetlands on the list on page 20, including the ephemeral ponds and wooded settings?
I don't think we have numbers on that, so if I had to guess, I would say it's not that low, but I don't have any data to give you a percentage.
Okay. So I grew up in a city that was built on top of all wetlands. Superior, Wisconsin, it's a real low-lying area. There was a glacial lake, there's a little hill just outside. It's kind of the continental divide of the Lake Superior watershed. It's the old Lake Agassiz, I believe it was called, and when the lake receded, we had this low-lying area, and that's where the city of Superior was built. So everything in the city of Superior essentially was a wetland. And I think the city of Superior is one of the few areas in the state that has utilized wetland banking extensively, and now you're looking at expanding this type of program to a lot of other places. Is that correct?
The city of Superior has a very unique way that its wetlands are managed through a special area management plan
Right.
that's developed and administered by both the Army Corps of Engineers and the state. So it's quite unique, and this legislation is not the same as a special area management plan, so it really wouldn't be the same.
Correct, but the city of Superior utilizes extensively wetland banking and mitigation.
That's true.
Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about the troubles with wetland banking and wetland mitigation. In Douglas County, a lot of the property that is banked for wetlands, number one, is outside of the Lake Superior watershed. So it creates a problem with potential water quality issues for Lake Superior. But number two, it creates a bigger problem for a lot of our townships. And I hear from them quite regularly, because what happens is you have a town board or a town of a few hundred people with a town board of 3 or 4 people. They're, it's almost kind of a volunteer job. All of a sudden they see productive land in their township being plowed over, and essentially what they do to create an artificial wetland is dig a hole on top of red clay and create some banks and fill it up with water and call it good. That's what I've seen in Douglas County. And what happens then is it really impacts the local communities because it takes that land out of certain tax categories, whether it's productive agricultural land or developable land. So it creates a financial strain on townships to benefit a different community. So in this bill, I think, you know, that's gonna be a potential problems for a lot of towns that don't have the expertise or the capacity to understand a lot of what's gonna happen when it comes to wetland banking and mitigation. Do you foresee that as being a problem?
I don't have a comment on that.
I don't think there's anything under this bill that would cause that to be a greater problem. I also don't think there's anything under this bill that will fix that problem there. I know of one situation in Douglas County where a DOT bank site was, you know, proposed in adjacent townships where that very issue, you know, arose. I haven't heard of too many other examples of that happening around the state. I think there's room within our existing wetland law for townships to have a seat at the table as mitigation bank sites are being evaluated so that they can, you know, be understanding what's going to be happening in their area to receive notification of those. I don't think there's anything in this bill that would change that dynamic one way or the other.
So how would a wetland mitigation or site be beneficial to a town where the site that's being disturbed isn't even within their municipality?
I guess that would be a very case specific. I'm not really sure how to answer that. There could be varying ways. If it's consistent with our comprehensive plan to be open space, if it provides recreational opportunities, there could hypothetically be some benefits there, but I think that would vary with each case.
How easy is it to replicate a natural wetland through wetland mitigation of creating these artificial wetlands?
Well, I think, you know, I guess I want to, one thing, we do recognize creation of wetlands, but there are also huge opportunities for restoration of wetlands as well, too. So there are many, as we already talked about, wetlands that were drained, and those wetlands represent, I think, an opportunity for wetland restoration. The Department of Natural Resources itself has many restoration projects that we have worked with under the stewardship program to reestablish wetlands. And I think that's an opportunity for mitigation as well too, is restoring drained wetlands as well.
So a lot of our last remaining existing natural wetlands contain some of the rarest species in Wisconsin. When you do a restoration or create an artificial wetland, is it easy to replicate the habitat and transfer those plants or animals and enhance their ability to exist in Wisconsin?
I don't think that what we're talking about in this bill is you know, first of all, when we go through this process, first that you have to avoid, minimize, and there can't be a significant impact on that wetland. If what you're talking about is a destruction of rare and endangered species, that's a significant impact. So that's one thing that we wouldn't allow under this proposal. So, however, if you go through the process and you go through that three-step process, we are going to require mitigation. And then mitigation in this proposal would be, I think, an enhancement.
In this process, though, is mitigation the priority, or is avoidance the priority?
Avoidance is the priority. This process is still the same. We avoid, we minimize, and there can't be any significant impact. But in the end, if the department authorizes the fill, there's mandatory mitigation also required. That's a change from right now, where there is not mandatory mitigation required. At the end of the process, you know, there's not mitigation required. I don't know what else to say.
So if the department authorizes a fill, is the mitigation gonna include having a wetland of the same quality as the one that's being filled?
Well, that's the mitigation is intended to offset at some level, and I think what we're talking about is a minimum offset of 1 to 1.2, and we have to be consistent with the core standards
Well-
for mitigation.
Well, there's a big difference between mitigating acreage and mitigating the structure and function. Mitigating 1 to 1.2 is like saying you're gonna get rid of the natural turf on Lambeau Field and replace it with 1.2 acres of artificial turf. Now, if you're gonna mitigate something, you should try to mitigate it so that it has the same structure and function within the same watershed, so that you're not endangering public health or environmental health of the region.
It is clear, this bill authorizes mitigation to be off-site. So it also allows, if you prefer, mitigation on-site and within a half mile of the, half a mile of the project. So on-site mitigation can still happen, but it also allows for in lieu of fees that could be established for mitigation processes off-site. So it does allow that, so if you're opposed to that, then you're opposed to that portion of the bill.
So you essentially, worst case scenario, you could fill in all the wetlands in the Lake Superior watershed and mitigate them in Waukesha County.
Hard for me to see how that could happen. I mean, that would be a significant impact. That would not, and it's hard for me to see how that would be wouldn't involve avoidance and minimization and avoidance of significant impact.
But you could mitigate outside of watersheds, so.
Yeah.
poten-
What this anticipates is that there will be a fund established that will be from mitigation funds in lieu of fees and surcharges on general permits, and the department will manage that fund. So, if what you're suggesting is that one area would be depopulated wetlands, I would think that the department would have a similar goal of trying to reestablish wetlands in that certain area to have a balance. So we think wetlands should be dispersed throughout the state as well.
Well, I would certainly hope that it's the state's goal and the department's goal to try to minimize the impacts on our last few remaining wetlands in Wisconsin. And if you are gonna have impacts, that you try to mitigate it so that what you're mitigating is comparable to what you're destroying. And just saying that you're gonna trade 1 acre of natural wetlands for 1.2 acres of artificial wetlands is not gonna accomplish that goal.
Let me comment here that the decision that we make to allow the fill will not, the mitigation is part of the factors that will lead up to the decision, but the decision we based upon whether or not, there is an avoidable impact, whether or not the decision has been made to minimize that, and whether or not there's significant impacts. And then mitigation is added on to that.
Yeah, I think I could add, we've had mitigation in Wisconsin for 12 years, so we have existing very detailed administrative code, very, very detailed guidelines, coordination with the Army Corps of Engineer. So all of those things would still occur, all those process steps and evaluation on a case-by-case basis for striving to restore the functional values that are being lost by permitted fill.
So how has that worked? Have we met the goal of trying to replicate the structure and functions of wetlands that have been filled, or is it more just a, exchange of 1 for 1.2?
The results have been a mixed bag. We've had some, as Ken talked about in the beginning of his testimony, we've seen that some on-site projects are difficult to manage, they're difficult to avoid having invasive species, difficult to restore functions and values if the site conditions weren't really appropriate for it in the first place, and some mitigation banks that are not maybe in the same watershed, but that can be highly successful. So I think our assumptions 12 years ago was that on-site was the best way to go, and we've seen that doesn't always work in every circumstance.
All right, thanks for your testimony.